You just walked to the fridge, opened the door, and slid your loaf of bread onto the shelf next to the milk. You've done it 1,000 times. You did it because someone, somewhere, told you the cold keeps bread fresh. And every single time you've done it, you've been making that bread go stale faster. Not slower, faster. I believed the same thing for the better part of 40 years. I was wrong. The fridge is one of the worst places in your entire kitchen to keep a loaf of bread, and the old Australians who baked their own knew it long before there was a fridge in the corner to blame. Here's the part that stuck with me. There's a simple trick, written down in a country handbook older than the war, that can take a rock-hard, day-old loaf and bring it back to life in about 10 minutes. No new bread, no waste. And I'll give you the whole thing before we're done, because it works in the kitchen you already have, in the house you already live in, with the oven you already own. I only worked this out because of a woman named Mavis. She was in her 80s, out past Gundagai, and I was standing in her kitchen while the kettle went. I looked around for the fridge and clocked a loaf sitting on the bench under a tea towel in an old chipped enamel bin. I asked her why she didn't keep it cold. She looked at me like I'd asked why she didn't keep her shoes in the oven. "The cold ruins it, love," she said. And she was right. And I've been paying for not knowing that my whole adult life. Let me tell you exactly how it ruins it, because once you understand this, you'll never open that fridge door with a loaf in your hand again. Bread goes stale for one main reason, and it is not drying out. That's the first lie we all swallowed. We think stale means dry, so we think cold and sealed must mean fresh. But staling is a chemical process with a proper name. Scientists call it starch retrogradation. When bread bakes, the starch inside soaks up water and swells into a soft, open structure. That's what makes a fresh crumb feel springy and tender. But from the moment that loaf leaves the oven, those starch molecules start slowly crystallizing again, squeezing the water out and locking themselves into a hard, tight structure. That's staleness. That's the leathery, crumbly, day-old feel, and it has almost nothing to do with moisture leaving the bread. Now here's the part that changes everything. That crystallizing process has a favorite temperature. It runs fastest not in a hot kitchen, not in the freezer, but in the exact temperature range inside your fridge. Somewhere between around 0 and 4 degrees Celsius, the staling reaction races along at top speed. Food scientists have measured this over and over. A loaf kept in the fridge can go stale several times faster than the identical loaf left sitting on the bench at normal room temperature. One day in the fridge does the damage of 3 or 4 days on the counter. Read that again. Every loaf you've ever saved, by putting it in the fridge, you were actually staling on fast forward. You thought you were protecting it. You were sabotaging it. And you were doing it because that's what you were taught to do. I did the sums on my own house once, and it made me sick. 2 loaves a week, and I reckon a third of every loaf went hard before we finished it, so I binned it. Call it 70 loaves a year straight in the rubbish over the years, half of them ruined by the very fridge I trusted to keep them. At today's prices, that's real money walking out the back door in a bin bag. And I did it with a clear conscience, because I thought I was being careful. But here's where it stops being an honest mistake and starts being something else. Because the funny thing is, our grandparents never made this mistake. They didn't refrigerate bread. They couldn't. And their bread lasted beautifully. So how did we, the clever modern lot, with all our appliances, end up worse at keeping bread than a woman with a tea towel and a tin? Because here's the thing that really got Mavis laughing at me that afternoon. She didn't just keep bread from going stale. When it did start to go, she brought it back. And that's the part almost nobody alive today believes is even possible. Think about who benefits when you believe bread belongs in the cold. Think about who benefits when your loaf goes stale in 3 days instead of lasting a week. The big packaged bread makers don't sell more bread when your loaf lasts. They sell more when it doesn't. When bread became a factory product wrapped in plastic and trucked across the country, it stopped being something you kept in a crock on the bench and started being something you bought again and again and again. The faster you got through it, the better their week looked. And that soft sealed plastic sleeve your supermarket loaf comes in, it's doing you almost as dirty as the fridge. Plastic traps the moisture coming off the crust and holds it against the bread. So the crust, which is meant to be the loaf's natural armor, goes soft and damp and turns into a mold farm. You've seen it. Green spots by day 4, and the whole thing off by day 5. That's not bread failing. That's bread being kept wrong in a bag designed to look fresh on a shelf, not to keep fresh in your home. The old Australians never wrapped bread in anything airtight, and that's not because they were poor and had no plastic. It's because they understood something we forgot. Bread is alive with moisture, and it needs to breathe. Now let me tell you where that knowledge actually comes from, because this is where it stopped being folk wisdom to me and started being hard fact. Out in Coolgardie, in Western Australia, back in the 1890s, during the gold rush, a man named Arthur Patrick McCormick built something that changed how the whole outback kept food. He built what became known as the Coolgardie safe. No electricity, no ice, just a simple box with wet hessian on the sides and a tray of water up top, sitting in a breeze. As the water evaporated, it pulled heat out of the box and kept everything inside cool and, crucially, at the right humidity. Not cold and clammy like a fridge, cool, dry, and breathing. It kept bread, butter, and meat fresh across a desert summer with nothing but water and wind. That principle, gentle evaporation and airflow instead of harsh cold, is exactly what your bread wants, and it's the exact opposite of what the fridge gives it. But the bread itself had an even simpler home, and this is the part I want you to hear if you think none of this applies to you because you rent, or you've got a small flat, or you haven't got room for some fancy contraption. This next bit is for you especially, because you don't need land. You don't need money. You don't need a tradesman or a new kitchen. You need 3 things you almost certainly already own, and about 2 minutes to change a habit you've had your whole life. Here's what the old-timers did, and here's what I do now, and my bread lasts nearly twice as long as it used to. First, get your loaf out of the plastic. If you buy a supermarket loaf, take it out of that sealed sleeve the moment you get home. I know it feels wrong. Do it anyway. Second, wrap it loosely in a clean tea towel or a cotton or linen cloth. Not tight. Just enough to shield it from the open air while still letting it breathe. That cloth does the same job the old baker's cloths did. It stops the crust drying out too fast on the outside while letting the loaf give off its natural moisture instead of drowning in it. Third, put the wrapped loaf in a bread bin, a wooden box, a ceramic crock, or even just inside a cupboard on the bench, away from the sun and away from the stove. That's it. Cloth, then bin, on the bench, not the fridge, ever. If you want to do it exactly the way Mavis did, use an unglazed earthenware crock, the old stoneware kind. The unglazed clay does something clever. It holds a little moisture in its walls and balances the humidity around the loaf, so the bread never goes bone dry and never goes damp and moldy. It's a Coolgardie safe for a single loaf, sitting on your bench, using nothing but the properties of baked clay. Op shops and garage sales are full of them for a few dollars because nobody knows what they're for anymore. I paid $4 for mine. Best $4 I've spent in the kitchen. Now, I can already hear the question, because I asked it myself. What about the fridge for the summer? What if it's hot? What if the bread's going to mold before I can eat it? Fair question. And here's the honest answer, and it's the opposite of everything we were told. If you truly can't get through a loaf before it turns, the answer is never the fridge. The answer is the freezer. And this is the second thing that stopped me in my tracks, because remember what I told you about that staling reaction. It runs fastest around fridge temperature, but drop the temperature right down below freezing, and the whole process very nearly stops dead. The starch can't crystallize when the water's locked up as ice. So the freezer doesn't stale your bread. It presses pause on it. And that's the question that took me down the rabbit hole. And the answer is not an accident. If this kind of buried practical knowledge is the sort of thing that gets you fired up, I've put together a lot more of it in my digital books. Aussie Basics, Deep Thrift, and the full system. They're the same no-nonsense approach you're getting right now. The old ways that quietly beat the modern habit, written down properly so none of it gets lost again. You'll find the details in the description below, and every one of them is built for the kitchen and the life you already have. But keeping a loaf fresh is only half the story. The trick the old cooks worked out, and that food scientists later confirmed, is to slice the loaf first, then freeze it. That way you pull out only what you need, 1 or 2 slices at a time, and the rest stays in suspended animation. A slice goes from the freezer to the toaster with no thawing at all, and it comes out tasting like the day it was baked. A whole frozen loaf can sit there for weeks and come back better than a 3-day-old loaf that's been sitting in your fridge going backwards. So think about what we've got here. The fridge, the place we were all told to trust, is the one place guaranteed to ruin bread fastest. The bench with a cloth beats it easily, and the freezer beats them all for keeping. Everything we were taught was upside down. The cheap old way wins, and the modern habit loses, and it loses badly. I want you to picture the waste this one gap in our knowledge causes. All over the country right now, there are people holding a day-old loaf that's gone a bit hard, and they're doing one of 2 things. They're throwing it out, or they're telling themselves it's only fit for the birds. Millions of loaves, every week, written off as dead, and they are not dead. Most of them can be brought back to life in the time it takes to boil the kettle. Here's why it works, and it comes straight back to that science I told you about. Starch retrogradation, the crystallizing that makes bread go stale, has one weakness. It is reversible. When you heat stale bread back up past about 60 degrees Celsius, those tight little starch crystals melt apart again, and the crumb goes soft and springy, almost exactly like it was fresh. The staleness undoes itself. The heat turns the clock back. For a while, that loaf is young again. Our great-grandmothers knew this cold, decades before anyone measured it in a lab, and I found the proof of it written down in black and white. In the old Country Women's Association cookery and household books, the ones the branches printed and passed hand to hand across rural Australia through the 1930s and 40s, there are instructions for refreshing a stale loaf that read like a magic trick but are pure kitchen science. Those women were feeding families through the Depression and the war years when you did not waste so much as a crust, and they had the method down to a fine art. It was common knowledge in every farmhouse kitchen. It was so ordinary, nobody thought to make a fuss about it. And that's exactly how it got lost, quietly, one generation at a time, as cheap wrapped bread made it feel easier to just buy another. So here is the whole thing. Here is what I promised you at the start. This is the trick, and I want you to try it this very weekend, because once you've seen a dead loaf come back, you will never throw one out again. Take your stale loaf, whole, and run the outside of it briefly under the cold tap, or wet your clean hands and pat the crust all over until it's damp but not soaked. Just the crust, just a light wetting. Then wrap the whole loaf loosely in a sheet of baking paper, or the old way, in a damp cloth. Put it into an oven heated to about 200 degrees Celsius, or roughly 400 Fahrenheit if that's how your dial reads. Leave it for about 10 minutes, maybe 12 for a big loaf. What happens inside is beautiful. The water you dampened the crust with turns to steam in the heat and drives moisture back through the crumb, while the heat itself melts those staling crystals apart. When you pull it out and unwrap it, the crust crackles crisp again, and the inside is soft and warm and springy like it just came out of the baker's oven that morning. For the next few hours, it's as good as fresh bread. Slice it, eat it, use it for sandwiches, whatever you like. There is one honest catch, and I'll give it to you straight because I'm not here to sell you a miracle. Once you've refreshed a loaf this way and it cools down again, it will stale faster the second time because you've driven that reaction forward. So the rule is simple. Only refresh what you're going to eat that day. Bring the loaf back, then finish it. Don't do it, cool it, and expect to do it again tomorrow. Do it and eat it. That's how the CWA women did it, and that's how it works best. Think about what that one 10-minute trick would have saved you over the last 10 years. Every loaf you binned because it went hard, every heel and crust you gave up on. All of it recoverable, all of it food you already paid for, all of it thrown away only because nobody ever told you the staling was reversible. I reckon that single piece of forgotten knowledge is worth a couple of $100 a year to an ordinary household, and it costs you nothing but a wet crust and a warm oven, and it goes further than bread. Once you understand that stale doesn't mean dead, you look at your whole kitchen differently. Hard biscuits, dry cake, a scone that's gone tough by tea time. A gentle warming brings most of it back, because it's the same starch, doing the same thing, undone by the same heat. The old cooks knew this instinctively. Nothing was thrown away that a warm oven could resurrect. I keep coming back to Mavis and that enamel bin on her bench, because she wasn't clever in some special way. She wasn't a scientist. She just never had the old knowledge taken away from her. She learned it from her mother, who learned it in a kitchen with a wood stove and no fridge at all, back when wasting a loaf was something you simply did not do. The knowledge was never wrong. It just got buried under plastic sleeves and cold shelves and the very modern idea that the appliance always knows best. We were sold the fridge as the answer to keeping everything fresh, and for a lot of things it truly is. But somewhere along the way, keep it cold became a rule we stopped questioning, and we started putting things in there that the cold actively harms. Bread was the biggest casualty, and the people who kept making and selling us fast-staling, plastic-wrapped, throw-it-out-by-Friday bread were never going to be the ones to tell us how to make a loaf last a week and come back from the dead. Why would they? The forgetting was good for business, but it's not good for you. It never was. You've been paying twice, once for the bread and once for the waste, believing the whole time that you were doing the right thing. So here's where we've landed. The fridge stales your bread fastest, so keep it out. Plastic drowns and molds it, so wrap it in cloth and keep it in a bin or a crock where it can breathe. If you can't finish it, slice it and freeze it, because the cold of the freezer stops staling dead while the cold of the fridge speeds it up. And when a loaf does go hard, don't you dare bin it, because a wet crust and 10 minutes in a hot oven will bring it back to life. 4 simple things. Not one of them costs a cent more than what you already do. Every one of them saves you money and food and the quiet guilt of throwing away good bread. That's the whole secret. The people who baked this country's bread for 150 years, out on the stations and in the farmhouse kitchens and in the CWA halls, knew every bit of it. We're the ones who forgot. And now, you don't have to. If it feels good to know that a chipped old crock from an op shop can beat your fridge at its own job, then you already know the truth about most of what we've been sold. The expensive, modern, throw-it-away way isn't smarter than the simple old way. It's just better at making us pay. Now, I want to hear from you, because I read every one of these. Tell me this. When you were growing up, did your mom or your nan keep the bread in a bin on the bench or in the fridge or somewhere else altogether? And be honest, before today, did you keep yours in the fridge like I did for all those years? Drop it in the comments and tell me which town or which part of the country you're watching from, because I love seeing how far this old knowledge really traveled. Somebody out there learned a trick their grandmother used that I've never even heard of, and I want to know it. If you're the kind of person who's had a gut full of paying for the expensive version of something our grandparents did for free, then you're one of us. Subscribe and stay, because this is exactly the sort of thing we dig up here week after week, the buried, practical, common-sense knowledge that quietly beats the modern way and saves you real money. And next time, I'm going to show you why keeping your eggs in the door of the fridge on that neat little egg shelf they built right in for you might be the exact spot that spoils them fastest, and what the old poultry keepers did instead to keep an egg good for months without any power at all. You won't believe how simple it is, and you'll wish someone had told you 40 years ago. I'll see you there.